I remember the exact moment my entire world stopped making sense. I was standing in the middle of a hospital corridor, my heels clicking against the cold tile floor, my phone pressed to my ear while my assistant rattled off the day's schedule. Board meeting at 2, press call at 4, dinner with the Singapore investors at 7, and then I heard it. A sound so small, so unexpected, so impossibly beautiful that I dropped my phone right there on the floor and didn't even notice it shatter. My daughter, my Lily, my 6-year-old, who hadn't spoken a single word in over 3 years, looked up at a man she had never met before in her life, a stranger sitting alone in a plastic waiting room chair, with tears running down his face, and she said, clear as a bell, soft as a whisper, "Don't cry. My mama cries too. It gets better." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stood there trembling. A woman who runs a company worth $400 million, completely undone by 4 sentences from a child doctors had told me might never speak again. And here's the thing I need you to sit with before I tell you the rest of this story. Was I wrong for what happened next? Because what I did in the aftermath of that moment, the choices I made, the things I said and didn't say, they changed everything. For Lily, for me, and for that stranger in the waiting room, whose name I didn't even know yet. I genuinely need you to tell me in the comments whether you would have done the same thing in my position, because even now, even after everything that followed, I'm still not entirely sure. To understand why those 4 words shattered me the way they did, I have to take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of that day, but the real beginning, to a version of my life that looks almost nothing like what I have now. My name is Serena. I grew up in a small town in central Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows your business and ambition is treated with a kind of quiet suspicion. My mother worked at a fabric mill. My father left when I was 9. I learned very early that if I wanted something, I was going to have to build it myself with my own 2 hands, because nobody was lining up to hand anything to a girl from Millhaven with secondhand shoes and a chip on her shoulder. I was relentless in school. Scholarships, early mornings, late nights, a full ride to a state university where I studied finance and business and treated every single class like it was the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. I worked 3 jobs my junior year. I interned at a tech startup my senior year for almost nothing and stayed until midnight every single night because I wanted to understand every part of how a business breathed. By the time I was 29, I had co-founded my own logistics software company. By 34, I was its sole CEO after buying out my partner. By 37, we had broken our first $100 million in revenue. The version of me that existed during those years was not someone you would describe as warm. I was effective. I was decisive. I was respected in conference rooms and feared in negotiations. I dressed the part, spoke the part, lived the part. And somewhere inside the armor of all of that, I was also deeply, completely lonely. I met Daniel at a charity gala when I was 35. He was an architect, quiet and thoughtful and funny in a dry, understated way that I found completely disarming. He wasn't intimidated by me, which was rarer than it sounds. Most men either tried to compete with me or shrink away from me. But Daniel just looked at me like I was a person, which, at that point in my life, felt like the most radical thing anyone had ever done. We dated for a year and a half, got married in a small ceremony in Vermont, and when Lily was born 2 years later, I genuinely believed I had figured out how to have everything. I took 6 weeks of maternity leave. I know, only 6 weeks, and I'm not proud of that. And I went back to work while Daniel did a modified schedule from his home office so he could be with her. Lily was an extraordinary baby. She was alert, curious, constantly babbling, her dark eyes tracking everything in the room. She started saying "mama" at 9 months, real words by her first birthday, full sentences by the time she turned 2. She was smart and observant, and she had this habit of tilting her head to one side when she was thinking, like a little owl, and it made my heart hurt with how much I loved her. And then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks before Lily's 3rd birthday, Daniel took her to the park. It was a beautiful September day. He pushed her on the swings and they ate peanut butter crackers on a bench, and they were driving home when a car ran a red light. The impact was on Daniel's side. He died before the ambulance arrived. Lily was in her car seat in the back, physically unharmed except for a small bruise on her collarbone from the seatbelt. But when I got to the hospital and I ran into that waiting room and I scooped her up, and she looked at me with those enormous eyes. She didn't say a word. Not that night, not the next day, not the next week. The doctors initially said it was shock, acute stress response. Give her time. We gave her time. We gave her a grief counselor, a play therapist, a speech therapist. We gave her a safe space and a gentle routine and patience I had to actively teach myself, because patience did not come naturally to me. Months passed, then a year, then 2 years. The diagnoses shifted and evolved. Selective mutism triggered by trauma. The specialists agreed, though there were layers of complexity they continued to work through. Lily communicated through writing on a small chalkboard she carried everywhere, through gestures, through expressions that were so vivid and specific she rarely needed words anyway. She was not an unhappy child. She laughed, silently, with her whole body. She drew constantly, beautiful intricate drawings of animals and houses, and what I recognized as memories of her father. And she was tender and affectionate, and wise in a way that floored me regularly. But she did not speak. And every single day of those 3 years, some part of me was waiting and hoping, and quietly grieving, and trying not to let her see me doing any of those things, because the last thing Lily needed was to feel like her silence was a burden to her mother. I had restructured my entire life around her during those years. I moved the company's operational headquarters so I could work closer to home. I hired a chief operating officer I actually trusted so I could be more present. I stopped taking international trips unless absolutely necessary. I learned how to slow down in ways I never thought I was capable of. I'm not saying I became a perfect mother. I didn't. There were still too many late nights and distracted evenings, and moments where my phone pulled my attention when it should have been on her. But I was trying in a way I hadn't known how to try before Daniel died, and I think Lily could feel that, even if neither of us had the words for it. The day everything changed. We were at the hospital for Lily's quarterly check-in with her developmental pediatrician. It was a routine appointment, the kind we'd done a dozen times, and Lily was in a good mood that morning, wearing her favorite yellow cardigan and carrying her chalkboard. The appointment went fine. The doctor was pleased with her progress in other areas. And we were on our way out through the main atrium when Lily stopped walking. She just stopped, the way she did sometimes, when something caught her attention, completely still, her head tilted to one side. I looked up from my phone. I was checking emails, I'm ashamed to say. And I followed her gaze across the waiting room. There was a man sitting alone in one of the blue plastic chairs near the window. He looked to be in his mid-40s. Maybe, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of tired that settles into a person's whole posture. He was bent forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and he was crying in that particular quiet way that people cry when they're trying very hard not to be seen doing it. No sound, just tears tracking steadily down his face while he stared at the floor. He didn't notice us. He was somewhere else entirely, inside whatever private devastation had brought him to that waiting room on that Tuesday morning. And Lily looked at him for a long moment, with that owl tilt of her head, and then she walked across the entire waiting room, all by herself, and she stood in front of him, and she waited until he raised his eyes to her face, and then she spoke. "Don't cry. My mama cries too. It gets better." So that is exactly where I was, frozen in the middle of the hospital corridor, with a shattered phone at my feet, and 3 years of held breath escaping from my chest all at once. And now I need to pause here and ask you something directly, because the next part of this story is where it gets complicated. I've told this to people close to me, and I've gotten completely different reactions, almost split right down the middle. So I want you, right now, to pause this video for a second and think about what you would have done next. Because what I chose to do in those next few minutes, and in the days that followed, set off a chain of events I absolutely did not see coming. Drop your answer in the comments before you watch the rest. I genuinely want to know. Here is what I did. After standing completely paralyzed for what felt like a very long minute, I walked across the waiting room, not to scoop Lily up and make apologies and move on, which is honestly what the CEO part of my brain was telling me to do. Don't make a scene, don't linger, you have a 2 o'clock meeting. Instead, I walked across the room and I crouched down beside my daughter and I looked at the man whose name I still didn't know, and I said, I'm so sorry to intrude. I'm Serena. This is Lily. She doesn't usually, she hasn't. And I stopped, because I was crying too, and I couldn't quite explain in a coherent sentence what had just happened. The man looked at me, and then he looked at Lily, and something in his face shifted. Not the grief was still there, but something loosened slightly, like a door opening a crack. He said his name was Marcus. He said he was there because his 10-year-old son, Noah, was upstairs having surgery, a routine procedure that had developed unexpected complications. He had been sitting in that chair for 4 hours alone because his ex-wife was flying in from out of and hadn't arrived yet, and he hadn't wanted to call anyone else because he didn't want to say the words out loud that Noah was in surgery, that something had gone wrong, because saying it made it more real than he could handle. I sat down in the chair next to Marcus. Lily climbed up into the empty chair on his other side, opened her chalkboard, and drew him a picture. It took me a moment to understand what it was. A boy, clearly, with a cape, flying above a hospital building. Noah, I realized. She had drawn Noah as a superhero flying out of the hospital. Marcus stared at that drawing for a long time without saying anything, and then he pressed one hand flat over his eyes, and his shoulders shook. But this time it was different. Less alone, somehow. I stayed for 2 hours. I called my assistant, and canceled the 2 o'clock and the 4 o'clock, and moved dinner with the Singapore investors to Thursday. I got Marcus terrible coffee from the vending machine. And we talked, not constantly, but in the comfortable intervals of people who for some reason don't feel the need to fill every silence, which was unusual for me, because I normally fill every silence like it's a professional obligation. Lily sat beside him and drew and occasionally held up pictures, and Marcus smiled at each one and told her what he saw in them, and she nodded or shook her head to confirm. When his ex-wife, a woman named Claire, arrived in a breathless panic, 2 hours later, Noah was out of surgery, and the doctor was already in the waiting room with good news. The complication had been managed. Noah was stable. He was going to be fine. Claire collapsed with relief, and Marcus stood up and they held each other for a moment, in that unguarded way that people do when they've been through something terrible together, regardless of what came before. And Lily watched all of this with her owl-tilt expression, and then looked up at me and nodded, once, as if she had known it was going to be okay all along. We exchanged numbers before we left. Marcus texted that evening to say Noah had been asking for the drawing of himself as a superhero, and that the nurses had taped it to the wall beside his bed. A week later, Marcus brought Noah to a small bakery near our neighborhood for a thank-you coffee. Noah was a serious, freckled kid who had apparently been told the full story of what happened in the waiting room, and had decided that Lily was, in his words, actually really cool for a little kid, which Lily received with great dignity and wrote back on her chalkboard, "You're pretty cool too, for a big kid." Noah laughed so hard he nearly spilled his hot chocolate, and something about that laugh, that specific laugh in that specific moment, made me feel something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not just happy. Hopeful. Like something was growing again in the place where things had gone quiet. Over the next several months, our families became tangled together in the gentle way that sometimes happens when circumstances introduce people who were somehow meant to find each other. Noah and Lily developed a friendship of spectacular oddness. He talked constantly, and she communicated through drawings and chalkboard notes, and they somehow understood each other perfectly. Marcus and I started texting, then talking on the phone, then having coffee while the kids played in the park, and I found myself looking forward to those conversations with an intensity that surprised me and also scared me, because I had not looked forward to anything involving another adult person in a very long time. He was good. Not good in a simple or uncomplicated way, but good in the way of someone who has been broken by things and put himself back together and is honest about both the breaking and the rebuilding. He talked about Noah with a tenderness that undid me every single time. He asked questions about Lily that were thoughtful rather than clinical, curious about who she was rather than fixated on what she didn't do. He never once, in all those months, treated her silence as a problem to be solved in his presence. He just talked to her like she was exactly who she was, and she, for her part, drew him more pictures than she drew anyone else except me. Lily's speech did not return in a rush after that day in the hospital. That would make a neater story, and this is not a neat story. She spoke again approximately 6 weeks later, at home, quietly, asking me to pass the maple syrup at breakfast, and I did pass it to her, and I said, "Here you go, baby," in the most deliberately calm voice I have ever produced in my life, because her therapist had told me that when it happened I should not make an enormous production of it. I should respond warmly and normally and not create pressure around the moment. Inside I was vibrating like a plucked string. The words came back slowly, selectively. She chose carefully who she spoke to and when and about what, and she continued using her chalkboard for many months alongside her returning speech. And her therapist said that was completely healthy, that the chalkboard had become a tool she trusted, and she would relinquish it when she was ready. She spoke to Noah for the first time in person, about 2 months after the bakery, mid-afternoon in our backyard, telling him that his fort design had a structural flaw. He was so stunned, he forgot to answer for a full 10 seconds, and then immediately took the criticism seriously. And they spent the rest of the afternoon rebuilding it, arguing cheerfully about load-bearing walls, in the way of people who have already decided they're going to be lifelong friends. She spoke to Marcus for the first time on a Saturday morning in November, when he arrived at our door with donuts and Noah and a bag of leaves they'd collected, apparently, for some craft project Noah had conceived. Lily answered the door because I was still upstairs, and she looked up at Marcus for a moment and she said, very simply, "You can come in, I'll get my mama." Marcus told me later, in a voice that was not quite steady, that it was one of the best things anyone had ever said to him. I believe him. I know exactly what it feels like when Lily decides to let you in. Here is what I know now that I didn't know before any of this happened. I spent 15 years building something enormous and external, a company, a reputation, a life that looked successful from every measurable angle. And I told myself that was the point. That was what I was for. That achievement was its own justification. And then I lost Daniel, and Lily went quiet, and I discovered that I had very little interior infrastructure for any of it. I had never learned to sit in a waiting room beside a stranger and simply be present. I had never understood that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is not a decision made in a boardroom, but a child crossing a room to tell a crying man that it gets better. I had never known that the life I actually wanted was not the one I had engineered so carefully, but the one that arrived, unexpected and a little broken and entirely real, in a hospital corridor on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Marcus and I are taking things slowly and honestly, and with an enormous amount of conversation about what we both need and what our children need, and I think that is the right way to do it. Lily's speech continues to grow. She still carries her chalkboard. She calls it her quiet voice now, which is the most Lily thing she has ever said. But she uses her regular voice more every week, and each time she does, it lands in my chest like a small miracle I refuse to take for granted. Noah declared recently that he and Lily are going to be best friends forever probably, and Lily wrote back on her chalkboard. Obviously, and I don't think either Marcus or I trusted ourselves to speak for a moment after that. If there is anything I can leave you with, it is this. Pay attention to the waiting rooms. Not just the hospital kind, all of them. The pauses in your life where you're between one thing and another, and the temptation is to scroll your phone, or plan your next move, or stay armored inside the efficiency of your own agenda. Sometimes the most important thing that will ever happen to you is sitting in the chair right next to you, crying quietly, waiting for someone to stop and notice. Lily knew that. She knew it before I did. She always knows things before I do, and I have decided that is one of the great privileges of being her mother. If this story moved you, please like this video. It genuinely means the world. And it tells me you were on our side through all of it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because I have more to share and I promise to always keep them real. And leave me your thoughts on this whole journey in the comments below. I read every single one, and your words matter more than you know. Did you think I was wrong to stay in that waiting room? Would you have done the same? Tell me everything. I'll see you all in the next story.